Hello and welcome to another video lesson with Mr. Roman. Today our lesson is titled Factoring Trinomials where a is greater than 1. And so here's kind of the big idea that we're going to be working with. Here we see a product of binomials, so x plus 4 and x minus 2. And when we multiply these two things together, we get this expression in simplified form, x squared plus 2x minus 8, and that's a trinomial. So going from here to here, that's using the distributive property or multiplying. But now we're looking at how do we go from this trinomial back to a product of binomials, and that process is called factoring or divide. And so let's look at a couple definitions to kind of solidify this. Factored form is an expression written as a product of factors. So here you see in blue, you have a product of two binomials, x plus 4 and x minus 2. Here you have a monomial, 3x, times a binomial, 3y minus 7. So here there's two factors, monomial and binomial. And then here you have a binomial times a trinomial. So again, two factors. And then the verb to factor something means you're trying to get it into factored form. So trying to get it up like this. And then remember, a quadratic trinomial is in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are real numbers. And then the sum product, we're looking for the factors of a times c that must add up to b. And this is how we're going to create our x marks the spot. So here's kind of an overview of the process. We're going to start with factoring out any GCFs that we see. Secondly, we're going to create the x marks the spot using a times c at the top and b at the bottom. And again, that comes from this formula. Third, we're going to split the b term. And then fourth, we're going to factor by grouping. So to be able to complete all of this, the prerequisite skills here are going to be factoring out a GCF and factor by grouping. So if you're not familiar with those, please go back and review those. So here we start with factoring out the trinomial. And here we can see that the greatest common factor between these three terms is just 1. And so we would call this, here's our end result. So our end result is going to look like this in factored form. Okay, so the question is, how do we get there? And so when we look at this, we see that the greatest common factor is GCF of 1, which means it's prime. So we can't factor out a GCF to start with. That's step 1. Now, step 2 is we're going to create the x marks the spot. So I've shown you here with the colors, we're going to go a times c, which is 30, and that's going to go at the top of our x marks the spot. And then b is equal to 17, and that goes at the bottom of our x marks the spot. And now we're looking for factors of 30 that add up to 17. Well, that would be simply 2 times 15, which is 30, and then 2 plus 15, which is 17. So that's step number 2. Then step number 3 is we're going to split the b term. So we're going to split up the 17x into 2x and 15x, as you can see here in blue. And then the 6x squared and the 5, they just follow along in this expression. Now we're going to use step 4, which is factor by grouping. And this is where we're going to factor out the greatest common factor between the first two terms and then the greatest common factor between the last two terms. So in the first two terms, the GCF is 2x, and that leaves us with 3x plus 1 inside the parentheses. Here, the greatest common factor is going to be 5, and so that also leaves us with 3x plus 1 inside the parentheses. And then now we can see that there's a common binomial here between the two sides. And so we're going to factor out that common binomial. And then what goes in the second set of parentheses is the leftovers. So we see the 2x plus 5 goes in this parentheses, and we call that the leftovers. So now we've gotten this expression into what I call factored form as we looked at to start. So again, reviewing that process, we start by factoring out the GCF. Number 2, create x marks the spot using a times c at the top and b at the bottom. Number 3, we split the b term. And number 4, we factor by grouping. So let's look at another example here. And our final result in factored form is going to look like this. And you can notice that there's going to be 3 factors, 5, binomial, binomial. And so now we look at number one, what's the greatest common factor? Well, the greatest common factor between these three terms is 5. And so when I factor out that 5, I'm left with 2x squared minus 7x plus 6. And so now that trinomial inside the parentheses, that's what we're going to look to make our x marks the spot, which is step number 2. So we're going to start with a times c, which is 12, and that goes at the top of our x marks the spot. And then we know that b is equal to negative 7, and that goes at the bottom of x marks the spot. And then we're looking for what are the factors of 12 that add up to negative 7. And in this case, that would be negative 3 times negative 4 would give you positive 12. And the negative 3 plus negative 4 would give you negative 7. So now, step 3, split the b term. So we're going to split this negative 7x into negative 3x and negative 4x, which you can see in blue there. And again, the 2x squared and the plus 6, they just follow along. And then the GCF of 5, that's on the outside still of these parentheses. Now we're going to look to find the greatest common factor between the first two terms and the second two terms. So this would be our factor by grouping. So the GCF here of the first two terms is going to be x, leaving us with 2x minus 3 in parentheses. Here the GCF is going to be negative 2, leaving us with 2x minus 3 inside parentheses. And now we have the common binomial, 2x minus 3, which we can factor out. And again, notice how the 5 of the GCF has followed us all along here. So the 2x minus 3 follows, and then inside the second set of parentheses, we're going to have our leftovers, which are going to be x minus 2 here. And then we would say that this is now in factored form, which is what we started looking at when we started this example. And that concludes our video lesson.